The house is dark except for one thin line of yellow light under the garage door. It's past midnight. The rest of the street is sleeping. He stands in the hallway of the home he built with his own hands, staring at that light, his palm flat against the door, not pushing, just listening. Something is happening on the other side. He tries the code. Wrong, tries another. Wrong, tries the one he was sure she'd never change. Wrong, 8 years of marriage. One door he can't open. And that's not even the part that's killing him. It's the smell. Every night she comes back to bed smelling like turpentine, like paint, like someone in the middle of making something they don't want you to see yet. Moreover, he raises his hand to knock, and stops. Because some part of him already knows whatever is behind that door is about to change everything. The clock on the nightstand said 11:58. Calvin Mercer had been watching it for 6 minutes. He was lying on his back, still, breathing slow. The way a man breathes when he's pretending to be asleep and hoping nobody notices the difference. Simone noticed, she always noticed. But tonight she moved anyway. He felt the mattress shift, felt the warmth leave, heard the soft drag of her feet across the hardwood, that careful rhythm she'd developed over the past 3 weeks. Careful, practiced. Like a woman who had gotten very good at leaving a room without being remembered. He kept his eyes closed until he heard the bedroom door click shut. Then he counted to 60. Old habit. Something his mother used to do before she'd go check on whatever sound woke her up in the night. Count to 60 first. Make sure it's real. Calvin had inherited the habit without inheriting the patience behind it. He got to 43 and opened his eyes. The room was dark except for the streetlight pressing through the curtain. Her side of the bed looked like she'd never been there. Pillow smoothed. Sheet pulled back to a neat diagonal. She hadn't rushed, she'd taken her time. Which meant she wasn't going for water or to check her phone or any of the other ordinary explanations his brain kept trying to hand him. She was going somewhere she meant to go. Calvin sat up. The house was quiet in the way houses get quiet after midnight, that thick, held breath kind of quiet that makes every small sound feel like an announcement. He could hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, crickets outside, the distant pull of traffic on Memorial Drive. And then, faint enough that he almost missed it, the electronic beep of a keypad being pressed. 1, 2, 3, 4 numbers. Then the soft, deliberate click of the garage door. He sat on the edge of the bed, hands on his knees, staring at the strip of darkness under the door. This was night 19, or night 19 of him noticing them. She had been doing this longer than that, he knew, because he'd started counting on the 4th night, when he'd finally accepted that it wasn't random. That Simone wasn't getting up because she couldn't sleep or because she'd forgotten to send an email. She was getting up because she'd decided to. The same time, every night, them. With the kind of quiet intentionality that you only develop when you've done something over and over until it becomes a part of you. He just didn't know what the something was. And that was the part that was eating him alive. Calvin Mercer had spent his entire adult life being good at knowing things. He was a structural engineer. He looked at buildings other people had broken and figured out exactly what had failed and why and how to keep it from happening again. He read load-bearing walls the way other men read faces. He understood pressure and tension, and the particular way things failed when they were asked to hold more than they were built for. He did not understand this. He pulled on a shirt, moved to the window, looked out at the side yard, which told him nothing. Then he turned and looked at the bedroom door for a long moment, the way a man looks at a thing he's not sure he has the right to open. He wasn't sure he did, but he went anyway. The hallway was dark. He moved through it without turning on lights, another habit, this one from childhood, from growing up in a house where you learned quickly which floorboards talked and which ones kept your secrets. 3rd Ward Houston had taught him that. Small house, thin walls, a mother who worked double shifts and needed every hour of sleep she could catch. Calvin had learned to move through darkness like he belonged to it. The kitchen was empty. The living room was empty. And there, at the far end of the hallway that led to the garage, a thin line of yellow light pressed under the door. She was in there. He walked to the door and put his hand on the knob, tried it, locked. Not the old lock. The old lock was a simple passage set, the kind you could turn from either side. This was something else. He crouched down and looked closer in the dim light and saw it a small keypad mounted to the door frame, silver. Knew the kind you'd see on a storage unit or a hotel room. She'd installed a keypad in their house, on the door to their garage, without mentioning it. Calvin stood up slowly. He pressed his palm flat against the door, not pushing, just resting it there. He could feel the faint vibration of something from the other side. Or maybe he was imagining it. Maybe he just needed to feel like something was coming through. He tried the first code. Her birthday, October 9th, 0109. The light on the keypad stayed red. Her mother's birthday, her college graduation year, The address of the apartment she'd lived in before they met, on Edgewood, the one she always said she missed. Red. He tried their wedding date last. Red. Calvin stepped back from the door, crossed his arms. Stood in the hallway at 12:14 in the morning. In his own house. Locked out of his own garage by a woman who had never once, in 8 years, given him reason not to trust her. Except now, except this. He went back to bed. He lay there with his eyes open and listened to the house and tried to remember the last time Simone had kept something from him. Really kept something. Not a surprise or a gift or the kind of secret that turns into a story you laugh about later. An actual secret. With a locked door. He couldn't think of one. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. 'Cause here was the thing Calvin Mercer had never said out loud to anyone, not even Simone. Especially not Simone. He had spent the better part of his adult life watching for the moment when someone he loved would leave without explaining why. He'd built an entire career around understanding what causes failure, what makes a structure give way, what happens when the load gets too heavy and the support underneath isn't what it appeared to be. His father had left on a Tuesday. Calvin was 9 years old. There was no fight, no dramatic scene, no indication whatsoever that anything was wrong. His father was there at dinner on Monday, pot roast, green beans. His father talking about something at work that Calvin was too young to understand, and then in the morning he was gone. Just gone. Like a piece of furniture someone had quietly removed in the night, his mother said. He needed to find himself. Calvin had thought about that sentence for 28 years and still couldn't make it mean anything. What he understood at 9 years old and at 37 was simpler and more brutal. People left. Sometimes without warning, sometimes without reason. Sometimes the person sitting across from you at dinner had already decided and just hadn't told you yet. He knew this was not a healthy way to live inside a marriage. He knew it. But knowing a thing and being free of it are two very different kinds of knowing. Simone came back to bed at 2:11. He heard her code in the keypad, heard the door, heard her rinse her hands at the kitchen sink. She always did that now, after the garage, like she was trying to wash off whatever she'd been doing before she came back to him. He heard her footsteps in the hallway. Careful, unhurried. She slid back into bed the same way she'd left it, smooth, deliberate. He stood still. She settled in, pulled the sheet up. And he could smell it then, barely. Just beneath the scent of the soap she'd used something sharp and mineral, like paint thinner, like turpentine, paint thinner. He lay in the dark and held that information up and looked at it from different angles, the way he'd look at a crack in a concrete wall, trying to understand what it meant, trying to understand what kind of failure it indicated. Paint thinner meant solvents. Solvents meant paint. Paint meant she was making something. But who made something in their garage at midnight? Who installed a keypad and locked themselves in for 2 hours and came back smelling like turpentine without ever mentioning it? He didn't ask. He didn't know why. Some version of not wanting to be wrong about what the answer might be. Some version of needing a little more information before he committed to a question that couldn't be taken back. He closed his eyes and didn't sleep for another hour and a half. In the morning, Simone made coffee. That was one of the constants of their marriage. She made the coffee. He made the eggs. And they divided the morning into these small, habitual kindnesses that added up to something that felt like home. She was standing at the counter in her robe when he came downstairs. Her hair straight and loose down her back. And she turned and handed him a mug and smiled and said good morning in that low, warm voice she had before the day got its hands on her. And he looked at her, really looked. She was, without any exaggeration, the most beautiful woman he had ever been in the same room with. He'd thought that the first night he met her, at a fundraiser for the Arts Center on Auburn Avenue, and he still thought it now, 8 years later, standing in their kitchen at 7 in the morning. Warm brown eyes that went gold in direct light. The way she stood easy upright, like she was comfortable taking up space in a room, which was rare, he'd learned, rarer than people acknowledged. And she was in a robe, hair loose, no makeup, not trying at all, still, the most beautiful woman. He took the coffee and said good morning back and sat down at the counter and watched her move through the kitchen and thought, how does a person look at something this certain every day and still be afraid? And then thought very easily, that's exactly, she asked. Fine, he said, which was a lie. But not the kind you call each other on. She poured her own coffee and leaned against the counter and talked about her day, a client presentation at 10, lunch with a colleague she liked, something about a campaign that was giving her trouble. He listened, asked the right questions, laughed in the right places, and all the while he was looking at her hands. Artist's hands, he'd always thought, long-fingered, careful, The kind of hands that moved with purpose even when she was just gesturing in conversation. He'd never thought to ask her why they looked that way. He'd just assumed it was her, just Simone. There was a faint stain near the base of her right thumb, blue, very faint, the kind that stays no matter how well you scrub. She didn't mention it, he didn't either. That was a Wednesday. By Friday, Calvin had started paying attention in the way he paid attention at work, systematically, quietly, without announcing that he was doing it. He checked the credit card statements for purchases he didn't recognize. Found several over the past 4 months from an art supply store on Peachtree. 2 from a lumber yard he'd never heard of. 1 from a shop that sold, he looked it up, professional grade canvas and linen. Canvas and linen. She was building something. He found the first reference to the hardware store the same week she'd asked him, out of nowhere, whether they had any power tools in the garage she should know about. He'd thought at the time it was just Simone being Simone. She liked knowing where things were, liked having information about her environment even when she had no immediate use for it. He'd told her where the drill was, showed her the shop vac, mentioned the extension cords. He hadn't thought anything of it, he thought about it now. That Sunday Simone's mother called. Gloria Hargrove called every Sunday. Calvin had been married to her daughter for 8 years, and had reached a version of peace with Gloria that he would describe, honestly, as armed neutrality. She was a woman who had raised her daughters with a set of very specific ideas about what success looked like and what it required, and what you were supposed to sacrifice to achieve it. And she had done so with such consistency and such conviction that it was genuinely hard to argue with her results. Both of her daughters had gone to good schools, had good careers, had made choices that looked, from the outside, like the right ones. What Gloria had not been trained to consider was what those choices had cost. Calvin knew this because Simone had told him once, in a moment of unusual openness, on a long drive back from Savannah. She'd said it almost quietly, like she was telling him something she wasn't entirely sure she was allowed to say. She'd said, "My mother never asked me what I wanted. She asked me what I was going to do with my life, and those are different questions." He'd thought about that distinction many times since. Gloria called. Simone took the call in the living room. Calvin washed dishes and did not listen, which meant he caught maybe 30% of it, which was more than enough. Simone's voice stayed even through most of it. She had a specific register she used with her mother, measured and slightly formal. The way you talk to someone whose goodwill you need and can't entirely depend on. Near the end it got quiet. Then Simone said simply, "I'll call you later, Mama," and hung up. She came back into the kitchen and picked up her coffee and said, "She's fine." Calvin said, "Good," and they moved on. But he noticed, that night, that Simone went to the garage earlier than usual, 11:15, 45 minutes ahead of her regular time. She was usually so consistent about the timing that the deviation landed like a small alarm. He noticed. He did not follow. The object had appeared 3 weeks ago, the same week the midnight session started. A small wooden box with a brass latch, about the size of a hardback novel, sitting on the shelf beside the window in their bedroom. Simone had placed it there without comment, and when Calvin had asked about it casually, passing by, she'd said it was just something she was keeping hold of. Old stuff. And moved on so smoothly that he'd let it go. He looked at it now. Every night when he went to bed, that box was on the shelf. Every morning it was still there. She didn't open it in front of him. She didn't move it. It just sat there, being present the way important things sometimes sat in a room, not calling attention to themselves, just occupying space and waiting. He did not open it. This was becoming a pattern with him, knowing where the questions were and choosing not to ask them. He understood analytically that this was a problem. A structural engineer who refused to inspect the crack was not being patient. He was being afraid. But he kept not asking. That Tuesday, Kelvin called. Kelvin Price was Calvin's first cousin technically, but they'd grown up more like brothers, raised on parallel blocks in 3rd Ward, sharing a grandmother on alternate weekends and a particular approach to life that involved saying exactly what they thought and dealing with the consequences later. Kelvin was 2 years older and infinitely less patient, which made him, Calvin had always thought, the most useful kind of friend to have, the kind who tells you what you already know before you've finished pretending you don't know it. "Come to dinner Saturday," Kelvin said. "Brenda's making that short rib thing you like." Calvin said he'd check with Simone, which meant yes. Saturday dinner at Kelvin and Brenda's was a thing they did 4 or 5 times a year. Good food, easy conversation. The kind of evening that reminded Calvin what a life felt like when it wasn't working itself into knots. He was looking forward to it more than he usually would, which told him something about the state of his week. Simone wore the deep green wrap dress. Calvin noticed, as he always did, the way the room adjusted when she walked in. It wasn't that she was trying to make an entrance, that was exactly the point. She walked in like she was just arriving somewhere she expected to be welcome, and the room responded to her certainty. Kelvin kissed her on the cheek and called her beautiful, which was true. And Brenda hugged her and pulled her into the kitchen, because Brenda always pulled people into kitchens, which was how she showed love. Dinner was good. The short ribs were good. The conversation was easy, the way it always was, with Kelvin and Brenda, stories that turned into jokes, that turned into arguments, that turned into everyone laughing. Calvin watched Simone across the table. She was present. She was warm. She laughed at the right things and added to the story at the right moments, and reached over and touched his arm twice, the way she did when she was happy. She was, by every visible measure, completely herself, and he still felt like he was sitting across from a woman who was keeping something from him. He hated that feeling. He hated it more because he recognized it. It was the same feeling he'd had at 9 years old, sitting at a dinner table with a father who was there and somehow already gone. He took a long drink of water and let the conversation carry him. And then Simone's phone, sitting face up on the table because she'd been expecting a work email, lit up. The screen showed iWeb, 10:48 p.m. Below the name, the first line of the text was visible before the screen went dark again. Deadline's coming fast. How's the final piece coming? Simone reached over and turned the phone face down. She didn't miss a beat. She was mid-law at something Brenda had said, and she kept laughing, and she flipped the phone over like it was nothing, like she'd simply been checking the time. But Calvin saw. And Kelvin, sitting diagonally across from Simone, had seen the screen from a different angle. Calvin felt his cousin's eyes on him for just a moment, checking them. Then Kelvin looked away and picked up his fork and said something about the cornbread, and the moment closed over itself like water. Calvin smiled when he was supposed to smile, said what he was supposed to say, and somewhere in the back of his chest, something that had been quietly tightening for 3 weeks pulled itself one notch tighter. On the drive home, Simone talked about Brenda's new curtains and a project at work, and whether they should redo the downstairs bathroom before the summer. Calvin drove and answered and agreed and disagreed in the right places. He did not mention the phone. He pulled into the driveway. Simone went inside. He sat in the car for a moment with his hands still on the wheel. Looking at the front of the house, he had designed himself every line of it. The pitch of the roof. The proportion of the windows. The way it sat on the lot with a kind of deliberate solidity that said, this is permanent, this is real, this was built to last. iWeb. Deadline's coming fast. He got out of the car. Inside, he said goodnight and went upstairs and lay in the dark and waited. At 11:20, he heard the bedroom door, the hallway, the kitchen, the beep of the keypad, the click of the garage door. He counted to 60. Then he got up and went down and stood in front of the garage door and tried the codes again. Birthday, graduation year, the Edgewood address, wedding date, red. He stood in the hallway, 12:14 in the morning. Then he did something he hadn't done in 3 weeks of this. He knocked. 3 times, quiet but deliberate, silence on the other side. Then Simone's voice, careful and steady, Calvin, not a question. She'd known it was him. It's late, he said. I know, who's I? Webb? Silence again, longer this time, long enough that he could hear his own heartbeat. Someone from a class, she said. What class? Another pause. Calvin, please, I'm not ready to. You installed a keypad on our garage door. No answer. You get up every night at midnight and you don't come back until after 2, and you won't tell me what you're doing, and now there's someone texting you about deadlines at 11 o'clock at night. He stopped, pressed his hand flat against the door. I need you to give me something, Simone. I'm not asking you to explain everything. I'm asking for something. He heard her breathe. I'm not ready, she said again, and this time her voice had something in it that wasn't quite steadiness. Something that bent just slightly under the weight of whatever she was carrying. 2 more weeks. Calvies, 2 weeks. 2 weeks, and I'll show you everything. I promise. He stood there, thought about his father's empty chair, thought about the keypad he couldn't open, thought about the smell of turpentine on a woman who had never, in all the years he'd known her, mentioned that she'd ever painted anything. 2 weeks, he said. He went back to bed. He lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and listed systematically everything he actually knew. Not what he suspected, not what he feared, what he actually knew. She was making something, in their garage, at night. It involved paint and canvas and professional-grade art supplies she'd been buying for months. Someone named iWeb was in contact with her about a deadline. She had kept all of this from him with a degree of planning and deliberateness that was not accidental. That was what he knew. What he did not know was why. And that was the gap he kept falling into. He picked up his phone. Kelvin had texted 40 minutes ago. You good? Calvin typed back, yeah. You see the name? Kelvin saw it. You know who it is? Calvin, not yet. Kelvin, you gonna find out? Calvin looked at the ceiling for a moment. Yeah, he typed. I'm gonna find out. But he lay there for another hour and a half before he closed his eyes. Because here was the thing underneath all the other things, the thing Calvin Mercer had been living with since he was 9 years old in a house in 3rd Ward, Houston, where a man's empty chair could rewrite everything you thought you understood. He was not afraid that Simone was doing something terrible. He was afraid that she was doing something that had nothing to do with him. That there was a whole part of her, a whole room in her where he didn't exist. Where the door had a code he didn't know. Where she went alone at midnight and came back smelling like paint and slipped back into bed beside him, like a woman who had learned to carry 2 lives at once without letting them touch. He was afraid that love could be real and complete and still leave a person with rooms they kept locked. He was afraid that the locked door was not about trust. That it was about something older and lonelier and harder to name. The wooden box on the shelf caught the light from the window, brass latch, smooth lid, sitting there patient as a held breath. Calvin looked at it for a moment. Then he closed his eyes, and this time eventually he slept. In the morning, Simone made coffee, handed him a mug, said good morning in her low, warm voice. He took the coffee and did not say, "Who is I, Webb?" And did not say, "I stood outside that door last night and felt like I was 9 years old." He said good morning and drank his coffee and waited, because he'd promised 2 weeks. And Calvin Mercer, whatever else he was a man who kept his word, even when it cost him, even when it was the hardest thing in the room. Monday morning, Calvin sat in his truck in the parking deck at work and looked up Isaiah Webb. 4 minutes, that was all it took. Professor Isaiah Webb. Faculty SCAD Atlanta. Department of Painting and Drawing. 22 years of teaching, MFA from Howard University. Work held in 3 permanent collections across the Southeast. The faculty photo showed a man in his mid-50s with close-cropped gray at his temples and the kind of expression that belonged to someone who had stopped needing to prove anything to anybody a long time ago. 54 years old, not a threat, not in the way Calvin's 3 a.m. thoughts had been building toward. But not nothing either. Because the faculty page did not explain why this man was texting Simone at 10:48 on a Saturday night about deadlines. It did not explain why Simone had a professor at all. Why she had enrolled in anything without saying so to the person she ate breakfast with every morning, and had been building a life with for 8 years. Calvin put his phone in his jacket pocket and went upstairs to work. He spent the morning on a structural assessment for a building in Midtown that had developed diagonal cracking along the east-facing load wall, the kind of cracking that told a clear story about differential settlement, one part of the foundation moving at a different rate than another. He walked the building with his clipboard and his flashlight, and did what he always did, looked at what had failed and tried to understand exactly why. He was good at this. He had always been good at this. And he spent the entire morning thinking about Simone. Because that was what happened when someone you loved was keeping something from you. It didn't stay in one place, it spread into everything. He'd be reading a crack in a concrete wall and hearing the sound of a keypad at midnight. He'd be calculating load distribution and seeing her turn that phone face down at Kelvin's dinner table without breaking her smile by even a fraction. He ate lunch alone in his truck, called Kelvin. "You find out who it is," Kelvin said before Calvin finished saying hello. "Professor at SCAD. Painting department." Silence then. "She's taking an art class." "Looks like it. For how long?" "That's what I'm still figuring out." "You checked the joint account?" He had that morning before he left the house. He'd gone through 4 months of statements. Found the art supply purchases he'd noticed weeks ago. Found nothing from SCAD. No tuition payment, no enrollment fee, which meant she'd paid from somewhere else, which meant she had money he didn't know about, not hidden exactly. They'd agreed early in their marriage to keep some finances separate, each of them with an account that was entirely their own, no questions asked. He had never thought to ask, had never needed to, until now. "She paid out of her own account," Calvin said. "I don't know how much, I don't know how long, but it's a painting class. A painting class with a deadline." Kelvin was quiet in the way he got quiet when he was actually thinking instead of just waiting to talk. "Okay," he said finally. "So she's doing something creative and she kept it from you. That's strange." He stopped. "I know it's not," Calvin said. "You sure? Because you sound like it might be." "I'm sure," and he was, mostly. The certainty sat in him clean and solid underneath all the other noise. "I just don't understand why she couldn't tell me. You're going to have to ask her. She asked for 2 weeks, and you're going to wait 2 weeks." Not a question. Kelvin knew him. "Yeah," Calvin said, "I'm going to wait." He finished his lunch. Looked at the parking deck wall in front of him, poured concrete, mid-80s construction. A surface map of fine cracks that were cosmetic and not structural. and would probably be standing long after everyone who'd ever parked here was gone. 2 weeks. He could do 2 weeks. He went back inside. The days moved the way days moved when you were watching them too closely, each one slightly longer than the one before. Calvin went to work, came home, made dinner when Simone worked late, ate with her when she didn't, watched television, read, had the normal conversations of a normal marriage in a normal house where nothing from the outside looked like anything other than fine. He did not bring up SCAD, did not bring up Isaiah Webb, did not mention the keypad or the turpentine or the 4 months of art supply purchases on the credit card. He waited, and he watched. Not deliberately, not in any way he was proud of. Just the natural watching that happened when you realized there was a shape to someone you loved that you hadn't fully seen before, and now that you knew the shape was there, you couldn't stop looking for its edges. What he saw, watching Simone that week, she was happy. Not a performance of happiness. Not the slightly elevated warmth some people put on when they were covering something uncomfortable. Genuinely, quietly, specifically happy. The way a person was happy when something in them that had been still for a long time had started moving again. She hummed in the kitchen, laughed more easily. Bought yellow flowers twice in 1 week and put them in the blue vase on the dining table like she was decorating for something. He was glad for it. He told himself that. He meant it. But underneath the gladness, something smaller and less comfortable sat and asked, why isn't the thing making you happy something you can bring into this room with you? Not a fair question. He knew that. Asked it anyway. Thursday, his phone rang with a number he recognized after a moment as Renee's cell. He and Renee Hargrove existed in a particular kind of truce that had held for 8 years without ever quite becoming warmth. She showed up at holidays. Sent birthday cards that were always slightly too formal. Said the right things in the right order. He'd never been able to point to anything wrong with her. She was just a woman whose relationships, when you looked closely enough, seemed to be organized around usefulness. Calvin. Her voice came in warm. Too warm, the way a room felt when someone had turned the heat up specifically before you arrived. I feel like I never get to talk to you directly. What's going on, Renee? Nothing serious. I just wanted to check in. Make sure you're doing okay. Make sure things are good between you and Simone. He waited, because that sentence had a back half she was going to deliver when she was ready. She can go internal sometimes, Renee continued. You know how she is. When something's on her mind, she just disappears into herself, and I know that can be hard for the people around her. She's fine, Calvin said, keeping his voice level. Of course she is. I just want you to know if things feel a little off lately, a little distant, it's not about you. It's just Simone being Simone. He sat with that phrase, turned it over, just Simone being Simone. Designed to sound like reassurance, actually functioning as something else, a preemptive frame. A way of turning whatever was happening into a pattern, something ordinary, something Renee understood and Calvin should simply accept without asking more questions. I appreciate you calling, he said, careful, even. But we're good. Of course you are. That's what I was so solid. Thanks, Renee. Let's get dinner soon, all 4 of us. Let's do that. He hung up, set the phone on his desk, looked at it for a moment. She knows. Not a suspicion, a fact that landed complete and clean without needing supporting evidence. Renee knew about the garage, about the midnight sessions, about whatever Simone had been building. And she had called not to support her brother-in-law, but to get ahead of something, to soften him, to position herself as someone in the know who was generously sharing information, which was not the same thing as someone acting in good faith. The question that followed was, why did Renee knowing make him feel worse than any other piece of this? He sat with it for the rest of the afternoon. By the time he drove home, he had the beginning of an answer. Renee didn't do things that weren't useful to Renee. That was the simple version. Whatever she'd done with the information about Simone, she'd done because it served a purpose. Not to protect Simone, not to help Calvin. Something that had to do with the interior economy of the Hargrove family in ways he'd never bothered to map because it had never seemed relevant to his life before. He didn't mention the call to Simone that night. Some instinct kept it back. The sense that certain pieces of information needed more time before he'd know what to do with them. He made grilled chicken and the rice with herbs she liked, and they ate, and she talked about a campaign giving her trouble at work, and laughed once at something he said and reached over and touched his arm. He watched the yellow flowers in the blue vase and thought, there is a whole room in this marriage with a door I don't have the code to. And the hardest part is not that I can't get in. The hardest part is that I didn't know the room existed. Sunday came slow, the way Atlanta Sundays did in late spring, with that particular sideways light that made the whole house look more considered than usual. Calvin was at the kitchen table with coffee and his laptop when he heard Simone's voice from the living room. Low, not secretive, just private. He was not trying to listen, he heard anyway. I can't talk about this right now, she said. A pause. I don't care what Mama said, this is not her decision. He did not move. You told her. Simone's voice dropped, but something in the shape of it changed. Something underneath went tight and sharp in a way he recognized the sound of a person who has just learned that a boundary they thought was understood was not, in fact, understood at all. Why would you do that? Not a question. A statement that had run out of patience for the question form. No, listen to me. If she calls that gallery, a pause. Just don't, Simone said. Quiet now. The kind of quiet that costs something. Please don't let her. He heard her set the phone down, then silence, then her footsteps. She came into the kitchen and stopped when she saw him. Just a fraction of a second, a pause so brief that if he hadn't been watching for it, he would have missed it entirely. Then she moved to the refrigerator and opened it and looked at things she probably wasn't seeing. Everything okay? He asked. Fine. The other kind of fine. Renee called me Thursday, he said. She went still, closed the refrigerator, turned around and looked at him with an expression that was not quite anger, not quite exhaustion. Something that had been living underneath both of those things for longer than the past few weeks. What did she say? That you go internal sometimes. That I shouldn't take it personally. Simone made a sound. The kind that was almost a laugh and had clearly gotten bad news on the way to becoming one. She called you, she said. She did. To tell you not to take it personally. More or less. She crossed her arms, leaned back against the counter, looked at a point slightly to the left of him. She had no right to call you. Probably not. This isn't her story to manage. I know that, Calvin. I know, he said again. Not to cut her off, just to let her know she didn't have to keep explaining the part he already understood. I'm not upset with you. I'm telling you because you should know what she did. Simone nodded slowly. Processing. He could see it happening behind her eyes, not the feelings. Those she kept behind something steady and controlled, but the thinking. The thinking always showed with her. She was working out the shape of a thing that was larger than she'd wanted it to get. 1 more week, she said finally. I need 1 more week. Okay, he said. She looked at him the way she looked at him when she needed to know whether okay was real. It was real. She crossed the kitchen and touched his face, just her hand against his jaw for a moment. Brief. Like a signature. Then she went upstairs and he sat at the table and looked at the yellow flowers and thought about 2 sisters and a mother and a gallery that someone might be calling. And thought, there is more underneath this than I can see from where I'm standing. That afternoon, Calvin drove to Gloria Hargrove's house in Cascade Heights. He had considered calling ahead. Decided against it, them. Calling ahead meant giving Gloria time to arrange a version of events, and he didn't want a version. He wanted whatever he'd find if he arrived before anyone had organized their face. The house was brick with a neat lawn and 2 rose bushes on either side of the front steps that were in full bloom, and looked like they had been blooming exactly this reliably for 20 years. Calvin had always thought the house looked like Gloria herself maintained, intentional, giving nothing away for free. She opened the door in her housecoat, reading glasses on a chain, them. Her expression moved through recognition, then rapid internal calculation, then a smile that had been practiced long enough to feel almost natural. What a surprise. I'm sorry to stop by without calling. Polite, not quite an apology. Do you have a few minutes? Of course. Come in. Her living room was a record of the family. Photographs on every surface, them, in frames that matched, them. Arranged with the care of someone who believed presentation was a form of love, or at least a substitute for it, them. School portraits, Easter dresses. The wedding photo of Calvin and Simone on the wall, Simone at 26, hair pinned up, laughing at something outside the frame. He couldn't remember what she'd been laughing at. Gloria sat in the armchair, folded her hands in her lap. The posture of a woman who had been having strategic conversations for decades and had gotten very good at waiting. I know Simone has been working on something, Calvin said. No warm-up. He had decided on directness in the car. Something involving painting. I know Renee is aware of it, and I got the sense from what I heard this morning that you are too. Gloria looked at him steadily. Renee mentioned it, she said. When? Earlier this week. What exactly did she tell you? That Simone has been taking art classes, that she's been working on a project at your house. Another small pause, this one with something weighted in it. That there's a gallery involved. Calvin kept his voice even. And what did you do with that information? Gloria's hands shifted slightly in her lap. I haven't done anything yet. Yet. He let that word sit between them for a moment. Mrs. Hargrove, he said. I need to ask you something directly and I need you to answer me the same way. He waited until she met his eyes. Is there any part of what's happening right now that has to do with the house on Sweet Auburn? Her expression shifted, just slightly, quick. A flash of something she hadn't planned to show. He'd seen that expression before on structural surveys, the moment when you pressed on a wall that looked solid and felt the slight give that told you the problem was deeper than the surface. That was a long time ago, she said. I understand that, but is it connected? She was quiet for a moment. The careful quiet of a woman choosing her next words with the precision of someone who knew that some things once said could not be taken back. Simone was always, she stopped, started again. She had a gift for it, even as a little girl. She could look at something and put it down on paper exactly the way she saw it, not the way it was supposed to look, exactly the way she saw it. Gloria looked at her hands. I pushed her towards something more stable because I didn't want her to struggle. Because I'd seen what happened to people who tried to build a life on something the world didn't always pay for. She paused. I don't know if that was right. I made a decision and I believed in it, and I still don't entirely know if it was right. Calvin said nothing. Let her have the space. The house, Gloria said, And the word came out differently from the others, a little heavier, a little older, The house was a financial decision. I had debts I hadn't told anyone about, and I ran out of time and options. I handled it badly. I know I handled it badly. She stopped. She came home and it was already. She stopped again. I should have told her, before. I should have called her and told her what was coming. I didn't because I didn't know how. Calvin sat with that, 62 years old, 30 years of keeping things managed and controlled and arranged, and underneath it, the same thing he'd been watching in Simone across a kitchen table, a woman who had learned to carry things silently because no one had ever taught her another way. She paints because she needs to make something that stays, Calvin said quietly, not accusatory. Just the truth of what he understood. That's what this is. That's what she's been doing in that garage. Gloria looked at him, and for a moment, just a moment, something in her face let go of whatever it had been holding. I know, she said, very quietly. He stood to leave. At the door, she said his name and he turned. She's not keeping it from you because she doesn't trust you, Gloria said. Her voice had gone to something smaller. She's keeping it because she doesn't trust it yet. The thing she's making. She doesn't trust that it's real enough to survive being seen. A pause, there's a difference. He drove home thinking about that distinction the entire way. Trust the person, not trust the thing. He understood that. More than he would have expected to, and in a way that had nothing to do with Simone and everything to do with a 9-year-old boy who had learned very early that the things you loved could be there one day and gone the next, and that the only reliable response to that knowledge was to hold on to whatever you had and not make too much noise about needing it. He understood not trusting a thing you loved enough to show it to someone else. He understood that completely. The wooden box was on the nightstand when he got home. Brass latch, smooth lid, patient as it always was. He looked at it for a moment, then went downstairs and made himself something to eat and sat at the table alone as the afternoon light shifted across the kitchen floor. That evening, Simone came home later than usual. She walked in with her work bag on her shoulder and her heels in her hand, barefoot on the kitchen tile, and she stopped when she saw him at the table. "You're home early," she said. "I left at 4. She set her shoes down, came to the table and sat across from him. She looked, he thought, like a woman who had been managing something all day and was tired of the managing. "I went to see your mother," he said. She closed her eyes briefly, opened them. "What did she say?" "She told me about the house. What actually happened." He paused and she said something else. Simone waited. "She said you're not keeping this from me because you don't trust me." He kept his voice steady. Wanted her to hear it as the thing it was, not an accusation and not a comfort, just a fact he was handing back to her. "She said you don't trust the thing you're making yet, that you're waiting until it's real enough to survive being seen." Simone sat with that for a long moment, then she said that. She did. Another silence. And something in Simone's face did something he hadn't seen in a while, softened in a way that wasn't performance and wasn't calculation. Just her face without the management. "My mother doesn't usually say things like that," she said. "No," he agreed. "She usually says things that protect her position." I noticed. A small, almost smile. "You went all the way to Cascade Heights to ask her about a painting." "I went because I needed to understand something, and I thought she might be the only person who could tell me." Simone looked at him steadily. Yes," he said. "It helped." She nodded slowly. Then she stood and went to the counter and stood there with her back to him for a moment, not doing anything, just standing there the way people stood when they were deciding something. 6 weeks, she said. "I've been working in the garage for 6 weeks. I started at SCAD 5 months ago, and 6 weeks ago I realized what I actually needed to make couldn't be done in a classroom. I needed space. I needed our house." She turned around. "I know you've been counting nights. I know you heard the keypad. I know you've been finding the pieces on your own because I wasn't giving you any." She met his eyes. "I'm sorry for that part. I was protecting the wrong thing." Calvin looked at her. "What were you protecting?" he asked. "The painting," she said. "I kept thinking if I tell him, it becomes something we talk about, something with expectations around it. And I've failed at this before." I walked away from it once and I spent 15 years telling myself it didn't matter. If I start again and fail again in front of someone who she stopped. In front of someone who loves you, he said. She looked at him. That's the thing you were afraid of, he said. Not a question. She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. He stood up, crossed to the counter, stood beside her the way he had stood beside her 100 times in this kitchen, close enough that the heat of her was something he could feel without touching. Finish it, he said. Just that, no conditions attached. She let out a breath, just one breath, but he heard what was in it, them. That night she went to the garage at 11, and he lay in bed without counting the ceiling shapes and without checking his phone, and without rehearsing conversations he wasn't ready to have. He lay there in the comfortable dark, which was a different thing from the uncomfortable dark he'd been lying in for weeks, and listened to his house settle around him. Just before 2 in the morning his phone lit up. Kelvin. You good? Calvin looked at the message, thought about everything he would have said a week ago. Thought about Gloria's voice in her living room saying she didn't know how to do the thing she should have done. Thought about Simone standing at the counter saying she was protecting the wrong thing. Yeah, he typed back. I'm good. He set the phone face down. The garage door had gone quiet. She was still in there, he could tell by the absence of the keypad beep that would have meant she was coming in. Still working. Still making something out of the inside of herself that she'd been keeping locked away for 15 years. He thought about what it meant to be a man who built things for as a living, and still hadn't understood until tonight that some things couldn't be built from the outside in. Some things had to come from inside the structure outward, and the best you could do, if you loved the person building, was make sure the foundation underneath them held. He closed his eyes, and this time sleep came without a fight. In the morning she was beside him when he woke, hair loose across the pillow, breathing even and settled. A faint smell of turpentine still in her hair that she hadn't quite washed out. He looked at her sleeping. Thought. 8 years. 8 years and there were still rooms in her he was only beginning to understand. That used to feel like a failure of knowing. Now it felt like the thing that kept this from being finished. The thing that meant there was still more to find. He got up quietly, made coffee, set her mug on the counter where she'd find it, stood in the kitchen in the early morning light and looked at the yellow flowers in the blue vase. Still there, still standing, as if they intended to keep being there for as long as anyone needed them to be. He told her over coffee. Friday morning, 7:12. She was at the counter in her robe, hair loose, pouring her second cup. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his hands around his mug, and the particular stillness of a man who had been rehearsing something since 3 in the morning, and was now deciding whether the rehearsed version was any good. It wasn't, so he didn't use it. I went into the garage Thursday, he said. The door wasn't locked. She went still. Not a dramatic still, not the kind that announced itself. Just the small, complete cessation of movement that happened when a person received information they had been both dreading and expecting for some time. She didn't turn around. I went to get the drill, he said, and the door opened. Silence. I stayed maybe 20 minutes. She set the coffee pot down, carefully, like she was buying herself a few extra seconds inside the gesture. You saw it, she said. I saw it. More silence. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed on the street. She turned around, and he looked at her face and thought, there it is. There's the thing she's been carrying. Because it was right there now. On the surface of her. Unmistakable, not anger. Not embarrassment. Something older and more complicated. Something that looked like a person standing at the edge of a thing they'd been standing at the edge of for a very long time. It's not finished, she said. I know. You weren't supposed to again. Quiet. I'm sorry. She looked at him, measuring something. What did you think? She asked them. And the way she asked it low, almost careful, told him that this question had been living in her for longer than he knew. That she had been sitting with the hypothetical version of this conversation for weeks. Maybe months. He took a breath. I thought you built something that I didn't know you had in you, he said. And then I thought that's not right. It was always in you. I just didn't know to look for it. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she crossed the kitchen and sat down across from him at the table, wrapped both hands around her own mug, looked at the surface of her coffee like it might tell her something. The house in the painting, Calvin said. She looked up. Sweet Auburn, he said. The one your mother sold. Something moved across her face. Quick, like a hand passing over a candle, there and then not there. Yes, she said. You were 19. Freshman year. I came home for the weekend. She stopped. Started again. There was a truck in the driveway. A man I didn't know was carrying boxes out of the front door. I stood on the sidewalk for she paused. I don't know how long I stood there. I couldn't move. I just kept thinking, this is wrong. This is someone else's house. I have the wrong block. Them. But you didn't have the wrong block. I didn't have the wrong block. He watched her hands around the mug, steady. She'd had a long time to practice steady. There was a painting on the curb, she said. Something I'd been working on over summer break. A view from the front porch, looking out at the street. My mother had put it out with the other things that weren't worth boxing. She stopped. It was still wet. Calvin sat with that, still wet. A painting put on the curb while it was still wet. The image of it landed in him and stayed. I picked it up, Simone said. Carried it back to campus on bus, held it the whole way. Trying not to smear it, she almost smiled. It didn't quite make it all the way, it still got ruined. But I kept it. Where is it? She looked at him. In the box, she said. The wooden box. The brass latch. The one on the shelf. Of course. I haven't opened it in about 6 years, she said. I just keep it because… She stopped. I don't know exactly why. Because it's the last thing I made in that house. Because throwing it away felt like agreeing to something I didn't want to agree to. Calvin set his mug down. Have you ever talked to your mother about it? Simone made the sound again. The cousin of a laugh that had gotten bad news. My mother's position is that she made a decision under difficult circumstances and that it was a long time ago and that I should have moved on by now. And Renee's position? Renee's position is whatever is useful to Renee. He nodded slowly. That tracked. Everything tracked now. She called me, Simone said. Thursday. She called me and told me she'd mentioned the painting to Mama. She looked at her coffee. She said she thought Mama deserved to know. Which is she stopped. Renee doesn't do things because people deserve them. She does things because they serve a purpose. What purpose does this one serve? Simone was quiet. There's a house in Buckhead, she said. Property my grandmother left. My mother controls it. Renee has been trying for 2 years to get my mother to include her in the decision about what to do with it. A pause. Information is currency with Gloria Hargrove, always has been. If Renee gives myself something useful, something that makes Renee look like the loyal daughter, then maybe my mother moves her name up the list. Calvin leaned back in his chair. She traded your secret for a real estate negotiation. That's the most Renee thing that has ever happened. He almost laughed. She almost did too. And then, from that almost longing place, something released. Something that had been held very tight for a very long time. He could see it happening in her face, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way of things that have been under pressure and finally find a crack to move through. I started painting again 4 months ago, she said. I signed up for a class at SCAD, Professor Webb. She paused. He doesn't explain things. He just asks questions. Good questions. The kind that make you understand what you're actually doing. She looked up. I paid out of my own account because I didn't want to have to explain it until I understood it myself. And the garage? 6 weeks ago I realized the class wasn't enough. I needed to build something larger. Something I couldn't do in a classroom. She looked at her hands. I needed to do it here. In this house. In the home we built. Because that's… She stopped. Part of what I was trying to understand was whether I could make something permanent. Something that stayed. The word landed between them and sat there. Stayed. He understood. Not because she'd explained it perfectly, but because he knew her. Because 8 years of knowing someone built a kind of fluency that didn't require complete sentences. She had needed to make something that stayed. In a home that was designed to stay. Built by a man who had built it to last. And she hadn't told him because the act of telling him before it was done, before it was real, risked making it into something that could be discussed and analyzed and weighed and found wanting before it had the chance to simply be. He got that. He got it all the way down. Okay, he said. She looked up. Okay. He says again, finish it. Something crossed her face that he didn't have a word for. Something that looked like relief and something else underneath the relief. Something that looked, honestly, like a woman who had been waiting for someone to say that for a very long time and had not known, until this moment, how much she'd needed to hear it. She nodded. Once. And that was enough. She went to the garage that night at 11, and the next night, and the night after that. He stopped lying awake. He lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around him and thought about permanence. About what it took to build something that lasted. About the difference between a structure that could hold weight and a structure that could hold everything. That Thursday evening the phone rang. Simone was upstairs. Calvin answered. Unknown number, Atlanta area code. Is this Calvin Mercer? A woman's voice. Older, measured. The voice of someone who had been running something for a long time and had gotten very comfortable with authority. It is. My name is Dorothy Sims. I'm the director of the Sweet Auburn Arts Center. I'm calling because I had an unusual conversation this afternoon, and I felt someone in your household should be aware of it. He sat down. Dorothy Sims spoke for approximately 4 minutes without interruption, which was the most extraordinary 4 minutes Calvin had experienced since the night he'd stood in front of his wife's painting. She described in precise and somewhat dry detail a phone call she had received from a woman identifying herself as Renee Hargrove. She described what Renee had said. The words unprofessional, the words marital difficulties, the implication, carefully constructed but unmistakable, that Simone Mercer was perhaps not in a stable enough position to execute a solo exhibition at this time. Dorothy Sims had listened to all of it, and then she had said, "I've been running this gallery for 30 years. In that time I have had work from artists in every kind of life circumstance you can imagine, and a great many you probably cannot. The work I accepted from your sister-in-law was accepted on the merits of the work. I don't receive instruction from family members of artists, and I don't intend to start." And then she had called Calvin, because she felt, she said, that the artist herself might need some advance notice. He sat with the phone in his hand after she hung up. Renee, not a surprise, not even really a shock. More like the final piece of a picture clicking into place. The thing that had been behind Renee's warm phone call. The thing behind the information she'd brought to Gloria. The thing behind all of it. She hadn't just traded Simone's secret for position in a real estate negotiation. She'd tried to use it as a weapon, directly, against the things Simone had been building in the dark. Calvin sat at the kitchen table for a long moment. Then he went upstairs and knocked on the bathroom door, where he could hear Simone brushing her teeth. "You have a minute?" She opened the door, toothbrush in hand, looked at his face. What happened? Not a question, he told her. He told her all of it, quietly and completely, the way he would have explained a structural report. "Here is what happened. Here is what it means. Here is what has already been handled by someone other than us." When he finished, Simone stood in the bathroom doorway and looked at a point somewhere past his shoulder for a long moment. Then she said, "Dorothy called you. She thought you should know." A pause. "Dorothy Sims has been running that gallery since before I was born." Another pause. "She accepted my work based on what she saw." She did. And Renee called her. She stopped. Let out a breath that wasn't quite a sigh. Something more tired, something that had been in the room a long time. Renee called her. "Yes." Silence. "I need to finish the painting," Simone said. I need to finish it tonight. The last piece. She stopped. "I've been circling it, trying to get the light right on the oak tree. But I think I've just been scared." She looked at him, direct, clear. "I think I've been scared that finishing it means it's real. And if it's real, it can be broken," he said. "Seen," she said. Different word, different meaning. He sat with the distinction. "Let me get dressed," he said. "Cal, you've been doing this alone for 4 months. He held her gaze. "You don't have to do the last part alone." She looked at him for a moment. The same checking look, asking whether this was real. It was real, she nodded. They went to the garage together for the first time. He had seen the painting in the afternoon light alone from the doorway. He had not seen it like this, with her beside him, with the work lights on full, with her standing in front of her own work the way an architect stands in front of a building they have spent years designing. Looking at it with that combination of pride and terror that came from having put something real into the world. He looked at the painting. Then he looked at her looking at the painting, and he thought, this is who she is. This is the whole of her. Not just the woman in the emerald dress who walked into rooms and made them rearrange themselves. Not just the brand strategist with the sharp mind and the careful voice. This woman standing in a garage in Atlanta at 11 at night with paint on her hands and her whole self present in a way he had seen glimpses of but never the full unguarded version. Until now. The oak tree in the upper left of the canvas was unfinished. He could see it now that she'd pointed it out. The branches were there, the general shape, but the light filtering through the leaves was wrong. Too flat, too certain. Real light through leaves was never certain. It moved, it argued with itself. "I can't get it to look like memory," she said. "It looks like a photograph, and that's not how I remember it." She picked up a brush. She stood in front of the canvas for a long moment without moving. "What do you remember?" he asked, quietly, not pushing, just giving her something to talk toward. She thought about it. "The light came through that tree in the afternoon," she said, "like it was being filtered through something, like it was older than it should be. Gold and green at the same time." She paused, "like something that existed before you and would exist after you." He didn't say anything. She lifted the brush and started to. He stayed. He didn't hover them. He found a stool at the work table and sat on it and didn't say anything, and watched her work, and occasionally when she asked, he mixed. She would say the name of the color or point to a tube and he would squeeze it onto the palette and mix what she directed and hand it back, and she would use it or not use it and keep going. He wasn't good at it. He mixed one batch too dark and she looked at it and said simply more white. He added white. "That's it," she said. "That's the color." Them. He sat on the stool and mixed colors he didn't know the names of and watched his wife make something out of nothing and thought, this is the best night of our marriage. Not a wedding night, not an anniversary. This This ordinary, extraordinary Thursday in a garage in Atlanta with paint under her fingernails and a brush in her hand, and the two of them alone together doing the thing that needed to be done. 2:40 in the morning, she stepped back, looked at the painting, didn't say anything for a moment then. "It's done." He got off the stool, stood beside her. The oak tree was different now. The light through the leaves moved. It was gold and green at the same time. It looked like something that had existed before them and would exist after them. It looked like memory, them. Like the real interior of a specific afternoon in a specific place that a specific person had carried for 15 years without knowing what to do with. It looked, honestly, like the best thing he had ever seen made by human hands. "Simone," he said. "Don't," she said. Quickly, not unkindly. "If you say something, I'm going to cry, and I've been holding it together for 4 months and I cannot cry right now in this garage." "Okay," he said. He reached out and took her hand. She let him. They stood in front of the painting and held hands like two people who had been standing on opposite sides of something and had finally found the same ground. The exhibition opened on a Saturday. The Sweet Auburn Arts Center had been a community anchor on that block for 11 years. It occupied a building that had gone through several previous lives, a hardware store, a barber shop, briefly a church annex, and had landed in its current form with exposed brick walls and high ceilings and the particular atmosphere of a place that had decided to take art seriously on behalf of a community that deserved seriousness. The painting was the centerpiece. They had arranged it on the main wall of the gallery's front room, lit from above by two warm-toned spots that caught the gold in the leaves and made the house breathe. Around it, on the adjacent walls, were the smaller works from Simone's months of class studies, experiments, the visible process of a person finding their way back to something. Professor Webb had suggested the arrangement. Dorothy Sims had approved it. The effect was of a journey that ended at the large painting the way a river ended at the sea. The wooden box sat on the reception table near the entrance. Open, inside, visible under a small lamp, was the original painting, the one from the curb, 15 years old. Two corners ruined where the paint had smeared, a view from the porch looking out at the street. The sky in it was the blue of an afternoon that had ended badly. A small card beside it said, in Simone's handwriting, "The last thing I made in that house. Carried home on a bus. I kept it because throwing it away felt like agreeing to something I didn't want to agree to." Calvin stood in front of it and read that card 3 times. Then he moved through the room. People had come, more than he'd expected for an opening on a Saturday afternoon in May. Neighbors, people from the community, a few of Simone's colleagues from work, which must have required a certain amount of courage on her part, to allow the people who knew her as one thing to see her as another. Professor Webb stood near the back wall talking to Dorothy Sims with the easy body language of two people who'd known each other a long time, and Simone. She was in the deep burgundy wrap dress, the one that caught light the way her paintings did, like it was thinking about something. Hair straight and loose down her back, moving through the room with the particular ease of a woman who was not performing ease but genuinely inhabiting it. She talked to people, answered questions, stood beside her own work without flinching, which was the part that got him, honestly. Standing beside your own work without flinching. He had no idea how hard that was until he watched her do it. He was standing near the entrance when Gloria came in. She had not been invited. That was the first thing he registered. She had not been told the date or the location by either Simone or Calvin, which meant she had gotten it some other way. Renee, possibly. Or the community grapevine that existed in Atlanta between black families of a certain generation, dense and efficient and not entirely controllable. She was wearing her good coat, the gray one she wore to church. She had her purse on her arm. She looked, to someone who didn't know her, like a woman attending an event she had every right to attend. And she did. That was the complicated thing. She did have every right. Calvin watched her from across the room. She moved to the main wall. She stood in front of the painting. And she stayed there for a long time. Long enough that people moved around her. Long enough that the gallery's ambient noise shifted and settled and shifted again. She stood in front of that painting the way a person stood in front of something that was asking them to account for themselves. Calvin moved through the room slowly. Stopped near enough to observe, far enough to stay out of it. He saw the moment Simone noticed her mother. It happened across the room and he saw it in her body before her face caught up a small stiffening, a recalibration. The almost imperceptible shift of a woman who had been moving freely through a space and had just encountered something that required a different kind of walking. She excused herself from the conversation she was in, crossed the room, stood beside her mother in front of the painting. He couldn't hear them from where he was. He watched the shape of it. Gloria still looking at the painting. Simone beside her, not quite looking at the painting. looking at her mother, looking at the painting, which was its own kind of looking. Then Gloria turned. She said something. One sentence. He saw the shape of it on her face, more than heard it, her face doing something unusual, something that did not come naturally to it, something that cost her to do. He saw her hold it for a moment, then she said something back. Short, even, them. And turned to look at the painting again, both of them looking at it now, standing side by side in front of the house that had been lost and built again out of memory, and turpentine and 15 years of carrying something without knowing it could be put down. Later, after the gallery had thinned out, after Dorothy had locked up the back rooms, after Professor Webb had shaken Calvin's hand and said that his wife had one of the most honest eyes he'd encountered in 30 years of teaching them, which was the kind of sentence that Calvin would be thinking about for a long time, he found Simone near the entrance. She was putting on her coat. He helped her with it. Stood close, she leaned back against him for just a moment briefly, before straightening. What did she say? He asked quietly. Simone was quiet for a moment. She said she didn't know I still remembered the house. What did you say? I told her I remembered everything. She paused, and that's why I painted it. He nodded. They walked out into the evening together. Auburn Avenue at early evening in late spring, the light going gold at the edges, the street holding on to the warmth of the day. Across from the Arts Center, in the small park on the corner, an oak tree caught the last of the afternoon light through its leaves, gold and green at the same time, moving, certain of nothing. All of it exactly as Simone had painted it. Neither of them said anything about it. They both saw it. That was enough. In the car she was quiet for a while, the kind of quiet that wasn't absence but fullness. He drove, didn't fill it. After a few minutes she said, Renee texted. What did she say? That she heard the opening went well, that she's sorry she couldn't make it. A beat. She was in the room. Calvin, I saw her. She came for 20 minutes but stood in the back and left before I saw her. He glanced at her. She saw the painting, Simone said. She stood in front of it for a while. Her voice was careful. Not angry, something more complicated than angry. And then she left. He thought about that. About Renee standing in front of the painting that she had tried to prevent from being shown. About what that was like, to see the thing you tried to stop and find that it existed anyway. Fully, completely, despite you. He thought that might be the thing that changes her, or it might not. There was no way to know. People were not always changed by the things that should change them. But sometimes they were. And sometimes the changing happened slowly, invisibly, in rooms no one else was in. He drove. The streetlights came on. You know what I keep thinking about? Simone said. What? That bus ride. She was looking out the window, carrying that painting home, trying to keep the corners from smearing, getting paint on my jacket. A long pause. I don't even know what I was. 19 years old on a bus in Atlanta with a painting in my arms that was already ruined and I couldn't put it down. But you didn't. I didn't. That's who you were, he said. At 19. In a situation that was genuinely terrible, your instinct was, I'm not putting this down. She turned her head and looked at him. That's also who you are now, he said. In case that's unclear. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the window, and he heard her quietly in the dark of the car. I know. And then, I think I'm finally starting to know. When they got home, the house was the same house it had always been. Same rooms, same hallway, same strip of streetlight under the bedroom curtain. But something in it was different, not in the walls, not in the structure that was solid. It had always been solid. Calvin had built it to be solid. Something in the air of it. Like a window had been opened somewhere, and the thing that had been sitting still had started to move. He made tea. Simone sat at the kitchen table with her shoes off and her hair still down and her hands wrapped around the mug and the burgundy dress catching light the way it always did. The wooden box was on the counter. She'd brought it home from the gallery. The original painting was back inside it. She'd opened the box to take it out for the exhibition, and now the box was open on the counter, the small painting visible, the two ruined corners facing up. Calvin looked at it. You should hang it, he said. She looked up. The original one, hang it somewhere. She looked at the small painting for a moment. It's damaged, I know. It's not finished. I know that too. She looked at it for another long moment, then she looked at him. Where would you hang it? Hallway, he said, between the kitchen and the stairs. So you see it every time you move through the house. She considered this. It's not good, she said, technically. I was 19 and I didn't know what I was doing. It's the most important thing you've ever made, he said. Technically doesn't have anything to do with it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she got up, took the small painting out of the box, held it at arm's length and looked at it with the frank, clear eyes of a painter examining work. Then she held it against the hallway wall between the kitchen door and the bottom of the stairs, turned to him. Here? There, he said. She lowered it. He found a nail and a hammer in the kitchen drawer, held the painting level against the wall. She marked the spot. He drove the nail. She hung the painting. They stood back and looked at it. Small, slightly damaged. A view from a porch looking out at a street. The sky a blue that belonged to an afternoon that had ended badly, and now hung in the hallway of a house that was ending nothing. It stays, Simone said, quietly. To herself, or to the painting, or to the 15-year-old version of herself who had put it on a bus and held it all the way home. It stays, Calvin said. She turned to him, and whatever she would have said he didn't find out them. Because she crossed the small distance between them, and put her arms around him, and he put his arms around her, and they stood in the hallway in front of the small damaged painting of a porch and a street, and a sky, that had once been the whole world to a 19-year-old girl who refused to put it down. A long time passed, or not that long, it was hard to say. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Outside a car passed. Somewhere down the street a dog that was always awake at this hour was doing what it always did. The house held them, which was what it had been built to do. Later, Simone went to sleep first. He lay awake in the dark in the comfortable way, not counting the ceiling, not listening for sounds he didn't want to interpret, just lying there in the particular stillness of a house where all the right things were in their places. He thought about the painting in the hallway. He thought about the large painting on the gallery wall, still there, locked in safely for the duration of the show. The oak tree catching light that moved. The house in colors that existed only in the interior of a specific memory. He thought about a woman on a bus at 19, in a city that was hers and not hers, holding something that was already ruined and refusing to let go of it anyway. He thought, that's the whole story, not the garage and the midnight sessions and the keypad and the 2 weeks. Not Renee's phone calls or Gloria's tight hands, or the catalog of small betrayals that people committed against the people closest to them out of fear and self-interest, and the general human difficulty of wanting good things for others when you were still so busy wanting them for yourself. The whole story was a girl on a bus with a painting, who grew up to be the woman beside him, who had kept the painting for 15 years in a box with a brass latch, who had finally decided that keeping it wasn't enough anymore, that it needed to be finished, that she needed to understand, once and for all, whether the thing she'd loved at 19 still existed in her, whether it had survived, whether she had, obviously, completely she had. He closed his eyes, Simone's breathing beside him, even, settled, them. The breathing of a person who had put something down, not lost it, not given it up, just finally found a place to set it that was solid enough to hold it. Outside the window, the street was quiet. The house did what houses do in the deep part of the night. It settled, made its small sounds, let its materials breathe and shift and return to rest. A home didn't last because of the materials. Calvin had learned that a long time ago, had learned it by looking at structures that should have lasted and didn't, by looking at structures that had no business lasting and had been standing for 100 years. The materials mattered, but what mattered more was whether the load was understood, whether the weight had been honestly accounted for, whether the people who built it had looked at what they were building and said, this is real, this is what it is. These are its limits and this is what it can bear, and we are going to build it anyway. He and Simone had built something, and it had held, not because nothing had pressed on it, because they had built it honest. He fell asleep. In the hallway, the small painting hung in the dark, the porch, the street, the sky that was the blue of an afternoon that had ended and then kept going, the 2 corners where the paint had smeared, the places where something had been lost and then carried home anyway. It hung there in the quiet, and it stayed.